My name is Jack. I am 28 years old and I can still feel the exact vibration in the floorboards when the wood of my acoustic guitar violently shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. It was a freezing Tuesday evening, but the storm inside our house was terrifying. My father, Robert, 55 years old at the time, stood towering over me. His chest was heaving, his face red with a furious rage I had never seen. The neck of my acoustic guitar, the instrument I had worked 6 grueling months bagging groceries to buy, was dangling from his tight grip like a broken toy. He threw the pieces at my feet, looked me dead in the eyes, and shouted that I was a pathetic failure chasing a childish fantasy. My heart shattered exactly like the cheap wood. Humiliation burned my throat, and the tears I tried to hold back fell silently onto the twisted strings. I packed a bag that night, walking out into the rain with nothing but the clothes on my back and a crushing weight of rejection. I swore I would never speak to him again, a promise I kept for a long, bitter decade. Until that one sold-out show in Chicago, where I looked down from the bright stage and saw him standing in the front row, holding a piece of cardboard that changed absolutely everything.
Before I continue and tell you how that emotional night ended and what was written on that cardboard sign, I want to take a quick second to ask you a question. I always love knowing where my personal stories are traveling to, so please drop a comment down below and tell me what city and state you are listening from right now. It really means a lot to me to see how far these words can reach. Now, to make you truly understand the shock of seeing my father in that crowd, I need to take you back to the very beginning of this nightmare. The harsh truth is, my father and I were never the kind of father and son you see in movies, playing catch or talking openly about our feelings. Robert was a tough, unyielding man, a shift supervisor at a local auto parts manufacturing plant. For him, life was a brutal equation of sweat, physical labor, and a steady paycheck. Dreams were a foolish luxury, and playing music was just useless noise that distracted you from doing honest work. I was 18 years old when the tension between us finally boiled over, but the fire had been slowly burning for years. I had always been entirely different from him. While he spent his weekends aggressively fixing old engines in the driveway, I spent my time locked away in my bedroom, listening to old records, trying to figure out how a simple melody could make my chest ache in the best way possible. My only real escape from the constant pressure of my house was hanging out with my best friend, Mark, who was also 18 at the time. Mark lived just 3 blocks away, and his family was a lot more relaxed than mine. His parents kindly let us use their detached, dusty garage as our personal sanctuary. We would sit on overturned plastic paint buckets for hours, Mark hitting away at a cheap drum kit, and me aggressively strumming a beat-up acoustic guitar that barely stayed in tune. Those loud, messy hours in Mark's garage were the only times I felt truly alive. My mother, Susan, who was 53 years old back then, tried her best to keep the peace in our house, but she was always terrified of my father's explosive temper. She was a quiet, gentle woman who worked part-time at a local bakery. Sometimes, when my father was working a late shift at the plant, she would slip a $20 bill into my jacket pocket and whisper that I should buy some new guitar strings. She secretly loved hearing me practice through the thin walls, but she would never dare to defend my music when my father was in the room. If he caught me playing in the living room, the devastating trouble started when the end of high school started approaching fast. My father had his entire vision for my adult life mapped out, without ever once asking me what I actually wanted to do. He had pulled some strings with his demanding boss and secured me an entry-level position at the manufacturing plant where he worked. It was a physically demanding union job, the exact kind of job a sensible, practical guy would kill for in our neighborhood. He handed me the thick application form at the dinner table one night, slamming it down next to my plate of meatloaf like a judge delivering a final verdict. He strictly told me to fill it out immediately and be ready for a formal interview with the plant manager on Friday afternoon. My stomach completely dropped into my shoes. I just stared at the greasy paper, feeling like it was a prison sentence being handed directly to me. I didn't say a single word. I just nodded slowly, terrified. But I was hiding a massive secret that was about to ruin everything. Mark and I had spent the last 3 weeks practically begging the busy owner of a local music venue to let us play a short 20-minute set at their upcoming Friday night talent showcase. It was our very first real gig, our first chance to play our original songs for a real paying audience, instead of just the empty boxes in Mark's garage. We had practiced until our fingers literally bled.
And the cruel irony of the universe was that the mandatory sound check for the showcase was scheduled for the exact same Friday afternoon as the job interview my father had set up. I was completely torn in half. I spent 3 sleepless nights staring at my bedroom ceiling, feeling sick to my stomach with anxiety. If I skipped the interview, my father would absolutely lose his mind. If I skipped the gig, I felt like I would be officially killing my own soul and surrendering to a miserable life. When Friday finally arrived, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie my shoes. My father left for work early in the morning, leaving strict instructions for me to wear his old suit and show up at the plant exactly at 3 o'clock. My mother nervously ironed the suit for me, giving me a sad, knowing look, but she didn't say anything. At 2 o'clock, I put the suit on. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, and I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. I looked like a tired, defeated old man trapped in a teenager's body. I walked out to the driveway, where my old bicycle was waiting. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the wind blow through the trees. Then, my heart pounding against my ribs like a hammer, I took the suit jacket off, threw it on the porch, grabbed my guitar case, and rode my bike as fast as humanly possible, straight toward the music venue. I chose my dream. I chose myself. The music venue was dark, smelling of stale beer and old sweat, but to me, it felt like a sacred cathedral. Mark was already there, nervously adjusting his drums. When we finally got up on that small, sticky stage and the bright spotlights hit my face, all my fear completely vanished. For 20 glorious minutes, I wasn't the disappointment of the family. I was exactly where I belonged. We played our hearts out, the loud music vibrating through my entire body. There were only about 30 people in the crowd, but when we finished our last song, they actually cheered. Real, genuine applause. A guy in the front row even whistled loudly. I looked over at Mark, and we both had massive, goofy smiles plastered across our faces. The rush of pure adrenaline was completely intoxicating. I felt 10 feet tall, completely invincible. But that high was violently crushed the moment I rode my bike back down my street and saw my father's heavy truck parked in the driveway. I slowly walked through the front door, my guitar case feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The house was completely silent, the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that always happens right before a massive explosion. My father was sitting in his worn-out armchair in the living room, staring blankly at the dark television screen. The application form I had never filled out was crumpled up in his large fist. He didn't even look at me when I walked in. He just asked, in a terrifyingly low, calm voice, where I had been. I stood frozen in the hallway, my mouth completely dry. I told him the truth. I told him I went to play a gig. I told him I didn't want to work at the plant, that I wanted to be a musician. Slowly, he stood up from the chair. His face was completely twisted in disgust. He walked over to me, ripped the guitar case out of my hand, unlatched it, and pulled out the instrument. That is exactly when the terrible scene from the beginning of my story happened. He didn't just break the guitar. He completely destroyed it with a terrifying, violent energy, smashing the wooden body against the hard edge of the heavy wooden coffee table over and over again until it was just splinters and loose, twisted metal strings. My mother came running out of the kitchen, crying and screaming for him to stop, but he completely ignored her. "You are a failure," he screamed at the top of his lungs, his spit hitting my face. "You are a lazy, pathetic failure, and you will never amount to anything in this world. Get out of my house." I didn't argue. I walked into my bedroom, grabbed a trash bag, threw some shirts into it, and walked right out the front door into the freezing, pouring rain. That first night away from home was the most terrifying, isolating experience of my entire life. I walked for 2 straight hours in the freezing rain until I reached Mark's house. I knocked on his garage door, completely soaked to the bone, shaking uncontrollably, with nothing but a black trash bag full of wet clothes. Mark didn't ask any questions. He just pulled me inside, gave me a dry blanket, and let me sleep on the cold concrete floor next to his drum kit. I lay there in the pitch-black darkness, listening to the rain hit the metal roof of the garage, feeling a deep, crushing sense of loneliness. My father's harsh, cruel words kept echoing in my head on an endless loop. A failure, a pathetic failure. Part of me wondered if he was actually right. But another part of me, a small, stubborn voice deep in my chest, promised that I would rather starve to death on the street than give him the satisfaction of being right. The next 5 years of my life were an absolute brutal nightmare of exhaustion and poverty. I managed to buy a broken-down 1998 Honda Civic for $500, and that car quickly became my entire world. It was my bedroom, my dining room, and my rehearsal studio all rolled into one cramped freezing space. To survive, I got a brutal night shift job at a massive logistics warehouse on the dirty outskirts of the city. My daily routine was sheer torture. I would arrive at the loud warehouse at 10 at night, the air smelling deeply of damp cardboard and thick diesel exhaust. My hands quickly became covered in rough, painful yellow calluses, not from playing my beloved guitar, but from violently hauling heavy, sharp boxes of industrial supplies onto wooden pallets for 9 hours straight. My back constantly screamed with every single bent, a sharp, shooting pain that radiated violently down my legs. When my shift finally ended at 6 in the morning, I walked out into the freezing parking lot, the bitter wind cutting right through my thin denim jacket, and climbed straight into my freezing Honda Civic. I would desperately wrap myself in a cheap sleeping bag and try to sleep for a few hours. Every single dollar I managed to save from that miserable job went toward buying a cheap pawn shop guitar and paying for gas to drive to whatever dirty dive bar would allow me to play. I vividly remember driving straight from the warehouse one evening to a dingy little dive bar called the Rusty Anchor. The owner, a grumpy guy named Frank, who was about 60 years old, let me play in the dark corner for tips and a free plate of cold fries. I sang the deeply emotional songs I wrote in the dark, lonely nights of my car. Nobody clapped. Nobody even looked my way. But I absolutely refused to stop. I tightly closed my eyes, pretended I was performing at a massive arena, and played the next heavy chord. The massive turning point in my life didn't happen overnight like in the movies. It was a painfully slow, agonizing crawl out of the mud. I started recording my raw, emotional songs in the front seat of my car using a cheap, cracked smartphone, and I uploaded them to the internet. For the first year, nobody cared. I would get maybe 10 views a week. But I kept posting. I kept pouring my absolute bleeding heart into the camera. And slowly, incredibly slowly, things started to shift. A video I posted about the night I got kicked out suddenly caught fire. People started sharing it. Strangers started leaving long, emotional comments saying they deeply related to my pain, that they had fathers who didn't believe in them too. My tiny audience grew from 100 to 1,000 to tens of thousands. Suddenly, the empty dive bars were replaced by small clubs, and those small clubs were actually filled with people singing my lyrics back to me. Eventually, I managed to quit the miserable warehouse job. I bought a small, decent apartment. I signed a real contract with an independent record label who genuinely believed in my artistic vision. Fast forward 10 full years from the terrible night my guitar was violently smashed, and I was staring at a completely different reality. I was 28 years old, and my manager had just booked the final show of my first major national tour. And the venue wasn't just anywhere. It was the historic Grand Theater, located right in the absolute center of my hometown in Chicago, the exact same city where I had frozen in my car and hauled heavy boxes. The show sold out in less than 2 hours. It was the biggest professional triumph of my entire life. But as the date got closer, a deep, dark anxiety started twisting in my stomach. Returning home brought all the painful ghosts back to life. The night of the massive hometown show, I was a complete nervous wreck backstage. The walls of the dressing room were covered in expensive mirrors, and when I looked at my reflection, I didn't see a successful musician. I just saw that terrified, humiliated 18-year-old kid standing in the living room while his father screamed at him. Mark, who was now 28 and working as my official tour manager, noticed my panic. He walked over, put a heavy, reassuring hand on my shoulder, and told me that I had earned every single inch of this stage, and that he needed to go out there and show them who he truly was. I took a deep, shaky breath, strapped my beautiful, expensive custom guitar across my shoulder, and walked up the dark stairs toward the stage. The roaring sound of 3,000 people screaming my name hit me like a massive physical wave. I walked out into the blinding hot spotlights, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. The energy in the massive room was absolutely electric. I stepped up to the microphone, looked out at the massive sea of faces, and started playing the first heavy chords of my opening song. For the first few songs, I was completely lost in the magic of the music, the adrenaline pumping violently through my veins. The crowd knew every single word, their voices echoing loudly off the high ceiling. It was beautiful. It was everything I had ever suffered for. But then, right as I was about to start playing the slow acoustic ballad I had written specifically about my father, I stepped closer to the edge of the stage and looked down into the crowded front row. And my entire world suddenly stopped spinning. My fingers completely froze on the strings. Standing there, pressed tightly against the metal security barricade, was my father, Robert. He was 65 years old now, and he looked incredibly different. His hair was completely gray, his strong shoulders were slightly stooped, and the hard, angry lines on his face had softened into deep wrinkles of exhaustion. Standing right next to him was my mother, Susan, crying softly into her hands. I literally stopped playing. The sudden silence from my guitar confused the massive crowd for a second, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My father wasn't screaming. He wasn't glaring at me with disgust. Instead, his hands were trembling slightly as he held up a large, torn piece of brown cardboard against his chest. I squinted through the harsh stage lights to read the thick black marker writing. The heavy words hit me harder than any physical punch ever could. The sign said, "I was wrong. You are not a failure. I am so proud of you. Please forgive me." I stared at those heavy, impossible words, and the massive dam inside my chest completely broke open. 10 years of deeply buried anger, 10 years of freezing nights in my car, 10 years of hauling heavy boxes with bleeding hands, 10 years of desperately wanting my father's simple approval. All of it rushed directly to the surface in a violent flood of emotion. The hot tears I had refused to cry for a decade suddenly poured down my face right in front of 3,000 people. My father, the toughest man I had ever known, was standing there with tears freely streaming down his own weathered cheeks, openly begging for his son's forgiveness in front of the entire world. I took a deep, shuddering breath, stepped back to the microphone, and with a severely cracking voice, I dedicated the song to him. When the incredibly emotional show finally ended, I immediately ran backstage, my chest heavily heaving. The security guards escorted my parents through the heavy metal doors. When my father walked into the dressing room, the thick tension was suffocating. We just stood there, staring at each other for a long, heavy moment. Then, without saying a single word, this tough, stubborn old man completely broke down, walked forward, and wrapped his heavy arms around me in a desperate, crushing hug. He sobbed onto my shoulder, repeatedly whispering that he was so sorry, that he had been a blind, foolish old man who let his own miserable fears blind him to his son's incredible talent. I hugged him back, feeling the rough texture of his old jacket, and in that exact moment, the heavy anchor of resentment I had dragged around for 10 brutal years finally detached from my soul. I forgave him. The impossible dream had not only saved my life, but it healed my family. Looking back now, I finally understand that my father's terrifying rage wasn't actually about hating my music. It was about his own deep fear of the unknown, his fear that I would starve in a world he didn't understand. The journey was absolute torture, but I learned that sometimes the most painful rejection is exactly the heavy fuel you need to push you through the darkest, coldest nights of your life. If he hadn't broken my guitar, I might have given up. Have you ever had someone completely doubt your absolute biggest dream? And how did you find the strength to prove them wrong? I really want to read your experiences in the comments below. Until the next story.